Welcome back to Kairos Conversations. Today we're going to be talking about how should I approach learning a new language? Should I memorize things? Are flashcards outdated? Stay tuned. Welcome back to Kairos Conversations. I am one of your co-hosts, Courtney Trotter, our resident Hebrew enthusiast, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Ryan Martin, our New Testament Greek guy. If you're someone who loves the original languages, digging into Greek and Hebrew resources, and you want to find out a little bit about the ancient Near Eastern culture, you have found the right place. Here at Kairos Conversations, we want to help you discover the world of the Bible through the original languages. All right, so Ryan, today we're not necessarily doing the ancient Near Eastern culture stuff like we have been for a while, or even looking at the original Hebrew or Greek text. Today we're going to talk about how we memorize things, is memorization important, and how should I go about learning this vocabulary that's now presented to me in the list, right? So can we learn a language without memorizing? That's our first question off the top. Can we do that?
That's a great question, and it totally depends on what we mean by memorize. I think in a lot of language pedagogy, as we talk about how do people learn languages, how do we teach languages, the word memorize has almost become a bad word. Oh man, you'll see marketed here's a way to learn language without memorizing.
Yeah.
And it's curious. It's what are we trying to get away from? And I think a lot of times what we're trying to get away from is boring, disconnected teaching that doesn't have the students doing things to learn the language, but just rather throws things at the students for them to have to figure out on their own, to just rote memorization without connection to anything. And I'm all about getting away from that. But should memorize be a bad word? I don't think so. I think we should be smart about what we memorize and not memorize things that we don't need to be memorized. I think we should do lots of language learning activities that are not just trying to memorize things, but hey, we're memorizing things all the time. Whenever your brain remembers something, there's a certain sense in which you've committed it to memory. So yes, memorization, not a bad word, just something that we want to use wisely and be careful with.
Right. So concepts without context is not a great thing. But if you're able to kind of connect that thing that you're trying to memorize to something you will actually use later, it can be really helpful. Again, our entire lives are based on things that we've memorized how to do and don't have to question it every single time we do it. Otherwise, we'd be paralyzed with indecision, right? So sometimes memorizing things helps. But how should we do it is a totally different question. So how do we sometimes see people memorizing, especially languages, in unhelpful ways?
Yeah. I mean, one of the most common strategies, I think, by students that are learning a language, or I don't know, trying to memorize in chemistry class, trying to learn their nomenclature, or trying to think, I don't know, third graders doing multiplication tables, anything where we're trying to memorize something. You have students that are just copying down over and over again. Students that are just looking at what's there and writing it down. They're if I write it enough time, it'll be, I don't know, some kind of muscle memory, or it'll just happen a lot. Or even less active, even more passive is just reading over and over. If I just read this, or if I say it out loud enough times, I'll memorize it. Well, kind of good teaching practices, and just what we know from a scientific, from a neuroscience perspective of the way people learn things, that's just really not that helpful. It doesn't make it stick. It doesn't make things stick with us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that. Thinking about that as well, and even just is it helpful? You mentioned in other subjects like science or math, we have to memorize certain nomenclature to understand the jargon with which they're talking about. And it's no different in a language. My brother-in-law builds computers. This is a side story for effect. But he was over at our house the other night and he was talking about the lights on the particular computer. And I was like, what are you even talking about? Because it was all acronyms, right? And he was like, oh, those are the lights. And I was like, oh, I don't know any of those acronyms. And he was like, I would love to watch a computer video that used 0 acronyms. It would take 2 hours, right? And so part of memorization is just getting that familiarity with the subject matter so you can communicate a lot of information in a very short period of time. And so it does help. And like you said, we want to go with ways that are more active, that get you participating with the information as a learner instead of passive, where you're just receiving it, but you have no need to use it. So when you don't have a need to use something as a learner, you tend to forget it. So that just goes with anything, really.
Sure. I mean, if you're just writing or reading, your brain is not having to do anything. It's not having to search and find. I mean, retrieval. This is what we want. We'll get to more of this later when we talk about why flashcards are so amazing. But to learn something, you have to kind of convince your animal brain that this is important for your survival. Otherwise, it just does it and then moves on, right? But when your brain has to retrieve something, to like go back, I'm picturing like if you've seen Inside Out, there's like the library of different like memories and stuff. Like once you go retrieve something, that pathway, that neural pathway is solidified and it gets quicker and it gets more accessible. So that's the game. Is how can I make my brain follow this pathway so that I can follow it again? And when you just copy or read over and over again, like your brain isn't having to do anything because it's right there on the page. There's no retrieval. Right.
And I like that, image that you used of kind of having a pathway through the forest, right? Initially walking into a forest, you could feel lost. But the more and more you tread through that forest, like it's going to become more familiar to you and you won't feel lost in it. And you'll, make your own little pathway, and you can move quicker and quicker through what once was seemed like a maze and a labyrinth and impossible to navigate. And that's kind of how learning language is. Like at first you can't even pick out sounds, you can't even read anything. But eventually you're like, oh wow, I can kind of understand what's going on, right? So because you're going through that dense forest of a new language. So we don't like the passive ways of memorization. We would rather do something active. How do we memorize something better? How do we discover something in the forest and make new pathways to get there?
Yeah. So don't just read them. Don't just copy them. What should we do? I mean, flashcards are amazing. And I don't know if that feels like old school to you. Like, oh man, Shirley has better things. I don't care. Do flashcards on an app. That's fine. If you have an app that gives you what you need to memorize something is you need to have something presented to you, like a question. And then you need to try to think of the answer. And really, whether you get that answer or not, initially doesn't really matter. Whether you get it right, like whether you like what's the capital of Texas? Oh, it's Austin, right? Oh yeah, it's Austin. Like that solidified the pathway. But let's say I don't remember that Austin is the capital of Texas. Let's say, what's the capital of Texas? Oh shoot, I don't remember. What is it? And then I look on the map. Oh yeah, it's Austin. That solidifies the pathway too. So whether I get the flashcard right or wrong, like my brain had to try to do something, and whether it succeeded or failed doesn't matter because like that path was blazed, to use your forest analogy. And your brain then thinks like, I need this. Like this is important information for me, and it strengthens that pathway. So flashcards aren't the only way to do this. Like when I was learning French, I used to just have like a long list of vocab words, and I would French on the left and put English right next to it. And I would just cover up the English with a piece of paper and just like write down the English again, looking at the French, and then cover up the French and try to go the other way. Like anything, like if you're trying to think, is this a useful activity for learning, for memorizing? Ask yourself, is my brain having to work at it? Like, am I having to retrieve? And if so, whether you're succeeding or failing, it's working. Like you're blazing that pathway, and it's going to become easier and easier and easier for you to go down that path again. Yeah, like you just your brain kind of needs that gap to question to itself, do I actually know that? So whether it's just a sheet of paper, moving it down the list, or if it's a flashcard, just literally having to flip it over, your brain needs that gap to wonder, do I actually know the answer or not? Because if you're just reading it, your brain never has to wonder, do I know it or not? So we like to advocate to our students, especially memorizing vocab, this idea of spaced repetition. Can you explain that to me? What is spaced repetition? Yeah, spaced repetition is so cool. It's this idea that the more times your brain goes down that path, the more times you correctly figure something out, the longer it takes to forget it.
Mhm.
Okay. So I've got a little image here of what we would call like a forgetting curve. And you'll see there, like that red line is just like you learn something, and then after a day or two or three, you don't remember the thing anymore. But let's say after that day one, that same information is presented to you again. Look at that curve. It takes longer for you to forget it, right? It doesn't go down as sharply. And then if you see it again on day three, it's like, oh wow, I know it. Like it's, I'm forgetting it even slower. And eventually, you imagine this out like 20 days, then it's basically just
Mhm.
a line, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I know this forever. So each time that you're presented with information, you know it longer. And where this works into spaced repetition is you need to, like, let's say you're learning a new vocab word in Greek. Oikos. Oikos means house. Let's say that you're learning that oikos means house. It's also Greek yogurt, right?
I was gonna say, or
Let's
yogurt,
say
either way.
let's say you're learning oikos. Like you need to see oikos, and then the next day, maybe you've forgotten it a little bit. You see it again. All right, it's back to
Mhm.
like I know it. And then now maybe you can go 2 days without seeing it and still know it. Okay. But then you're reminded of it again. Oh, now maybe you could go like 4 days without seeing it and still remember it. So the more times you do something, the more time you can go without having to review it. So as you're thinking about what to study, right when you learn something, you need to study it pretty frequently to keep it up. But after a while, you don't need to go through it as frequently. Right. There are vocab applications, on the Greek and Hebrew side of things, which is where we are. The Bible vocab app, it's
Yes.
fantastic. It works this into we'll put a link to this down in our notes. Like the Bible vocab app keeps up with what you know and what you don't know. And you could put like, I want to work on the vocabulary in Mark chapter 5. And it knows which words you've practice in previous kind of blocks of vocab, and it's not going to give you those as frequently, and it has them just in these 10 different or maybe more than 10 just boxes of frequency, and it does all this for you, so you don't have to do anything. You just swipe through, and
Yeah.
if you know it, it puts it in the next box. If you miss it, it puts it back at the beginning so that you get it a lot again. So that's spaced repetition, and it's
Mhm.
the best way to learn anything, or really kind of what's happening behind the scenes as we learn things. We realize that, oh, the more I am presented with this information, the longer I can remember it.
Right. It's kind of like whenever you learn to, like, we all can go back to our hometown and remember all of those roads, right? Because it was like the first time we started driving. And so all of those roads really got imprinted on us very deeply. So even though it's been years, maybe since you've been to your hometown, you still remember how to drive around. And because it was really presented to you frequently as if it was very important material. And then now you can go a really long time and still go through and successfully navigate your way through whatever set of information it happens to be.
Yes.
So we advocate the Leitner method, what's called the Leitner method, when it comes to flashcards. So how about you explain that to us? And we're letting Ryan explain it because this is kind of his deal. He really loves reading about this kind of stuff. So
I do. Yeah,
yeah.
I love thinking about how people learn things. And I'll just, maybe this is a good time for to say the book Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. I'll link that. I'll put that in the show notes as well, by Brown, Roediger, and McDaniel. It was kind of my first exposure to a lot of these things, and I've seen it like in my own life and in the lives of our students really come true and work.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Leitner method is the idea of having your flashcards be in a series of piles or boxes based on how well you know it. Okay. So you have box one, which is like, oh man, I just learned these. I don't know these at all. I need to be drilling these like right now. Box two, which is like, I know these pretty well, but I still need to be going through them at least every couple of days. Box three, it's like, I know these pretty well. I want to see them once a week to make sure I keep them. Box four being like, okay, I like really know this. I don't need to go over this. I don't know, maybe, but once every 6 months. And I don't know, maybe you even have a fifth box that's like, I mean, I'm never, as long as I live, going to forget that like Hotheos is God or Hologos is word.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and you can do this in 3 boxes or 10 boxes. I have one student that had she'll probably watch this and be embarrassed, but this is a good thing. Has a folder with these pockets. She had 6 different pockets in her folder, and she put her flashcards in her folder pockets, and it was based on this. And the idea in the Leitner method here, if I can pull up this image, is that like when you get something right, 1 or 2 or 3 times, you move it over to the next box, right? You say, okay, I don't need to do this one as much. until it's in box 5 or 6 or whatever, and then it's kind of you don't even need to do it anymore. But then whenever you miss one, you like move it all the way back to box 1
Mm-hmm.
because you missed it. You don't know it. You need to know it, and you don't. Um, and it doesn't matter how many boxes you have, and it doesn't matter, maybe box 1 you go through every day, box 2 you go through every other day, or you can
Mm-hmm.
even just kind of be like, oh, I haven't gone through box 3 in a while. Let's go through box 3. But the idea is spaced repetition. The more you know something, the less frequently you have to go over it.
Yeah, that's a really good word. And we'll end today. Like, Ryan lived abroad where he needed to speak French. And so he's kind of gone through this process of having to learn a new language as an adult, which makes it just a little bit more difficult than if you were a child.
Yeah.
And doing it in an immersions kind of setting where you're living in Belgium, you're living in France, and also having to kind of do the memorization like he was talking about. So what was that process like for you as you were learning that?
It was a great experience. I did like an immersive, like we lived in Belgium, we lived in France, we lived in Montreal, Canada, and just kind of like lived, ate, slept, breathed French for 6 months. And it was awesome, right? Like I learned so much just by going to coffee shops and trying to order coffee and sounding, trying not to be embarrassed as I tripped over my words, and it was great. But guess what? I was memorizing stuff too. I was working on vocab lists. I was going to grammar school. Um, it was not like I was doing everything I could. I was doing the more
Yeah.
inductive, like living languages approaches to things. And I was also just like, I'm just going to write this list of vocab cards. I'm going to memorize them as quick as I can because I want to know these words.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I think in discussions about how language learning should be, we get this either or to where it's like, man, if a thing works, let's do it. Let's do the thing that
Yeah.
works. Anytime somebody says like, oh, you can learn languages without, I think the follow-up questions would be, okay, well, but should you?
Mm-hmm.
Why not? Like, everybody learns differently. So let's just like find lots of good things that work and do them.
Mm-hmm.
Like for us in Greek and Hebrew, like we want students to be exposed to the biblical text early and to start reading early.
Yeah.
To see these things they're learning in context. But we also tell them the grammar rules. We tell them how it works. We practice learning vocabulary because,
Yeah.
I mean, until we have a time machine, we can hop in and go back to first century Palestine and learn how to speak Greek, Koine Greek like a first century Jew.
Yeah.
Like most of our students are busy and they're in class once a week for 90 minutes type
Mm-hmm.
of situation. Sure, they're going to learn lots of things inductively, but we want to bolster that with good, like memorizing the
Mm-hmm.
right things. We talk
Yes.
about students' brains all the time as suitcases. Like you can only put so much in the suitcase, right? When you're going on a trip, you don't want to pack everything you own in the suitcase. It
Mm-hmm.
won't fit. You want to think like, what is worth putting in the suitcase?
Yeah.
As we work with our students, we're like, what is worth memorizing here, right? What is
Mm-hmm.
worth room in students' brains as they're inductively learning, as they're going through the
Mm-hmm.
language? What do we want to spend time talking about and telling them to make flashcards out of, to like
Yeah.
learn these grammar charts that help them be able to read more quickly as they're picking up on things naturally as well. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. And I feel
Right.
like my experience of learning French kind of, I think, reinforced that, same thing that
Mm-hmm.
the pedagogy people talk about, that these experts on adult learning talk about.
Right. Exactly. And like you said, we can't really do the full immersive experience like you can with the living language when it comes to Greek or Hebrew. But that's why, we try to get in the text early and often and like make it feel less intimidating than if you were just, going from a book to the text after having studied all the grammar. Right. And so we just try to use the variety of different language approaches that we know work and that help to stick it into that long-term memory so that, it could take a long time to master these languages, to be as good as some of these scholars who are behind me on my shelf. But we can have good facility with the language. Like, we can move around and we can use it and we can kind of see things that we wouldn't be able to see in our translations, even at a very early stage. And a lot of that just comes from being able to memorize the right things, like you're talking about, concepts in context and not kind of getting caught into one or two camps. Well, yeah, I think this was a great video. This was a video I know, like, I would love to be able to just send my students, say, this is how we want you to learn flashcards or something. And so
Sure.
I'm glad we made it. Any questions or any comments before we go?
I enjoyed this too. I mean, I love Greek. I love
Mhm.
talking about the New Testament, but I also love talking about how to learn Greek, and how to learn languages in general.
Yeah.
Not just Greek and Hebrew, but this is very fascinating to me. And if some of you are watching that are coming from not the biblical languages world, but just want to know good tips on memorization and such, like I'm welcome, and I hope that this helps you and serves you well.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you for joining us at Kairos Conversations. If you are fans of ours, just be sure to like, share, and subscribe. We've got a few Patreons, which we're really excited about and thankful for your work in helping to support what we do here at Kairos Classroom. And so if you want to join our Patreon community, you sure can, and go on over to patreon.com and check us out at Kairos Classroom. But we will be sure to see you next time here at Kairos Conversations.